Hello, hello, welcome, please come in. Our whip-only journey through Souls games is now at an end, but before I can put this series to bed, it's time for the summary video. Our required compare and contrast of all the games included in the series. And wow, were whips way better than I expected. I've heard only awful things about whips basically across the board, so I went into this series with the lowest of expectations, and having now completed all the runs, I'm not going to say whips are good, but they are not nearly as bad as many people have said. And having a challenge be easier than expected is always a welcome surprise. So let's start with the good. Whips have pretty good reach, basically across the board. The Arumi is obviously the most significant in this regard, but all whips across these games hit over a pretty decent distance. The timing of whip attacks are also really good at taking down NPCs, be that random invaders, or a boss. This wasn't too impactful since I play offline, but it is a pretty good benefit. That actually ends the good things. Beyond that, whips are slow, don't actually deal that much damage, and struggle to have anything worthwhile to say. Oh, you can buff them with spells and consumables in every game, and while that doesn't fix the damage they do, it does actually help a lot. On the other hand, basically every weapon in the game shares the same point and starts way better, so I'm not sure if that should count as a good thing. Oh well, let's get into the comparison. And that starts with difficulty, and that starts with Dark Souls 1. And I think Dark Souls 1 is going to go right into the last place on difficulty. All of the games on this list were a lot easier than I expected, but Dark Souls 1 was definitely the easiest. First up is that weapon buffing aspect. Magic Weapon and its improvements add a flat bonus to damage, which means even with the whip's pretty poor base damage, I was still dealing okay damage, even at the end of the game. The damage numbers certainly weren't anything to write home about, but they were definitely workable. Combine that with whip's genuinely quite good reach, and whips handled the bosses in this game quite well. Even bosses I was expecting to be a bit difficult just didn't stand a chance. Orny and Smoo couldn't really do that much when I had the reach to actually hit them in phase 1. Nito was a bit trickier because I didn't have a spare whip to make Divine to deal with the skeleton adds. Gwyn could have really posed a problem because whips were robbed of critical hit animations, but instead I could just parry hits in the heaviest armor and everything was fine. Compared to later FromSoft entries, Dark Souls 1 is usually the easiest. On the other hand, whips in Dark Souls 1 are probably the worst they have ever been. So it was a real toss-up where this game would land, but then I looked back through the bosses and found nothing? Seriously. I think Quelaag was the only boss that was actually a problem this run, and a lot of that comes down to taking the back route into Blighttown, so I was both under-leveled and my weapon was under-upgraded. Even then, the fight wasn't actually difficult, it just took forever because I was dealing no damage. Other than that, I think Seath had the most deaths, and that wasn't difficulty, that was incompetence. Most other bosses in the game were 1 or 2 shots, and most weren't even close. And I'm as surprised as anyone by this. Whips are really bad in this game. They are weak, they have slow attack speeds, they don't really have any redeeming qualities except their reach, and that above average weapon reach combined with Magic Weapon to fix the damage, it turns out is all you really need. This was another pretty easy romp through Lordran. Next up is DS2, and this gets to slide into the middle position. DS2 is definitely harder than DS1, but it can't quite place in the top difficulty. And a big problem that DS2 runs into immediately is damage. Unlike DS1, Magic Weapon is no longer a super useful spell. Magic Weapon now applies a damage buff based on the weapon's damage, and given that the damage of whips is bad, this isn't nearly as useful to cast. Instead, DS2 must rely on status effects for damage. And this is, as is usually the case in DS2, a mixed bag. The Notched Whip is pretty good and pretty easy to grab early. The big problem with the Notched Whip is that bleed is not very good in this game, mostly because it deals 200 flat damage when it triggers, and that means it's okay at low levels against the early bosses, and stops being useful entirely by the mid to late game. Setting aside all the bosses that are just immune to bleed, which it turns out is a lot of them. At least the Notched Whip's base damage is pretty good. Then comes Poison, and this is also a mixed bag, but for different reasons. Poison in DS2 is quite good. It still deals flat damage, but it's about 1,000 damage. Admittedly, it's damage over time, but not actually that much time. The real problem with Poison in this run in particular is that whips are really bad at applying it. Whips don't have great status buildup to begin with, and the slow speed of whip attacks compounds the issue. Both the basic whip infused with poison and the spotted whip acquired from the Soul of the Demon of Song have just awful base damage. So, while poison itself is normally quite good, I'm not actually convinced it was worth using in this run. The Notched Whip may have just been able to deal more damage in the same amount of time. Damage aside, whips have all the same benefits as they did in Dark Souls 1, which is to say reach. And while I wasn't expecting that reach to make too much of a difference here, it sure did, at least in some places. The Shrine of Amana was downright hospitable compared to normal, which is delightful. At least until I tried to get the Petrified Dragon Bone in the middle of this circle. DS2 still manages to get the second position because the endgame bosses here were much harder than anything in DS1, and harder than I had expected. Every playthrough I forget that the Throne Twins can be a problem. In a casual playthrough, this boss is super easy. Neither boss is durable, and both can be flattened pretty quickly. But with whips, my damage, bad. My attack speed, worse. And both bosses are quite aggressive. Even Nashandra managed to sneak in a kill at the end, and that's Nashandra. Honestly, half my problem is that I'm used to this fight in a casual run where I've probably done the DLCs and am 40 to 60 levels higher. Turns out being pretty low level actually does make a difference. Who knew? And that gets us to Elden Ring, which, as the empty spot on the list would suggest, gets to be placed in the top slot in difficulty. And that all comes down to Elden Ring being a harder game. Because its difficulty is not a failing of whips themselves. Whips are better in Elden Ring than they have ever been. You get statuses with good build-ups on the pedal whip, or both pedal whips if you decide to dual wield them. The Irumi is frankly stupid in how effective it is, and weapon buffs are very good. Particularly Determination and Royal Knight's Resolve, boosting the damage of a charged attack by such a large percentage is very nice. The Irumi was my main weapon throughout the entire run, and there was a reason for that. The Irumi scales pretty well, especially when set to Keen, and the charged attack is delicious. Though the reach on the charged attack is a bit deceptive, it doesn't actually hit as far as it looks like it should. So, with whips being better than they have ever been, really only lacking a critical hit, DS2 best Dark Souls, why does this game earn the top spot? Oh right, the bosses. The bosses are way harder in this game. Malekith, Godskin Duo, even Hoaraloo, which I was not expecting. So while the whips are a lot better in Elden Ring than any prior entry, you do reach some struggle points, as it were. And a weapon has to be very, very good to overcome the damage jump from DS2 to Elden Ring. And the whips in this game certainly are not that. There are good things. Gideon can be a really annoying fight in this game, but gets completely shredded by whips because he is an NPC, and really none of the difficulty I ran into in this run was whip specific. Malekith is always going to be a bit challenging because I don't remember his moveset. Fire Giant is always going to suck because it's a bad boss. Radagon will always... Actually, the Radagon fight was mostly fine. One big thing whips lacked in Elden Ring was stance damage. Not surprising, but very few bosses had their stance broken, even once. And while whips can't make use of that opening for a critical hit, stance breaks are still very useful for getting in free hits. Instead, I just had to deal with attacking around the boss's attacks the whole time, which whips weren't bad at, but if I'm looking to complain, that would be where I would direct it. And now we arrive at the recommendation section, and Dark Souls 1. And I think I'm going to slide Dark Souls 1 right into the middle position. I'm not really sure exactly where this should go, actually, but I do need to make a decision, and this is going to be it. Whips in Dark Souls 1 get to be mid. My ultimate inclination is to not recommend this. I think it falls just below that line. Whips in DS1 are better than I expected. In fact, they were way better than I expected. Their good reach, combined with okay damage with magic weapon, meant I could actually get through a lot of bosses more easily than I'd expected. Four Kings is the big standout, as that is a straight DPS race, and I didn't even need to use Power Within. I just won the fight with the build I already had. And that surprise victory is how most of the bosses felt. So why is it only middle position? And why is it probably a not recommend? Whips are better than expected, but they still aren't good, and more importantly, they still aren't fun. Whips really struggle in the traversal areas. Their damage is bad, spellcasts are limited, and the attacks are slow, which means that while the bosses are surmountable, the areas are kind of a slog. Sen's Funhouse is at an all-time low. Nulando is awful to get through. It's just area after area where defeating enemies takes a while, and the whip moveset is kind of miserable to use. Whips in DS1, arguably all Dark Souls games, are really only good at fighting NPCs, and there are not a lot of NPCs in this game. But if DS1 was ranked second, and ranked as not recommended, what comes after that that is worse? And it's DS2, and I can basically repeat the exact same description here as I did for DS1, but with some slight tweaks. Whips are honestly basically the same here as they were in DS1. They do get a backstab animation, which was very surprising, but otherwise they are very similar. Weapon buffs are worse on whips, but whips also get dubiously useful status effects, so there are differences, but not really any improvements. And where whips in DS1 really struggle with traversing areas, DS2 actually does way better. Whips have a pretty good hitbox and can stun a lot of enemies. It actually makes traversal easier in many cases, which was a very unexpected change. Iron Keep was mostly a breeze, just time the first attack right and the weebs get stun locked. Same for the Halberdiers in the Shrine of Amana. DS2 is a game famous for its hostile areas, and they honestly didn't feel all that hostile. No, the problem with DS2 was the inverse. Normally easy bosses made it really annoying thanks to whips having bad damage and bad attack speed. I've already talked about the twins, but Mirror Knight was awful. My attacks would bounce off his shield way more often thanks to the slow speed of my attacks. Velstadt was a long drawn-out nonsense fest thanks to slow attack speed. Really just every fight in this game was a slog. Even when whips were performing better than expected, they still weren't performing well. DS2 also sometimes feels awkward to control, and the game loves to have your character attack the direction they are facing, not the direction of the enemy you are locked onto, which means a long attack animation into the middle distance. And then comes Elden Ring, top of the pile, as usual, and the only run on the list I would actually recommend. What can I say? Whips are good here. The Arumi is a silly weapon, yes, but it also deals pretty good damage, has good range, and has one of the better charged attacks in the entire game. I didn't use it a ton, but the Pedal Whip is amazing if you spec for it to inflict really any status effect you want. And if you do the Volcano Manor quest more thoroughly, you can even grab a second one and dual wield. I didn't, but you could. So many status effects. The Candle Whip I picked up got thrown in a box and never looked at, but it and the Giant's Braid give fire options for Faith Dex and Faith Strength respectively, and both can actually be quite good. I don't have footage of them being good, but my sources tell me they can be good. The game also has a lot of really good weapon buffs that could, and maybe should, have been used here. It's hard to tell what stat investment would be worth it, but most weapon buffs scale off stats rather than the weapon's default attack, so it's possible something like Scholar's Armament or Bloodflame Blade may have actually been better than Determination and Royal Knight's Resolve. That would require splitting my stat investment, so it's hard to say without more testing. Suffice to say though, that whips really delivered here. Elden Ring also just has better controls and character handling than prior games, so a lot of the control issues of prior games have been long resolved. So yeah, Elden Ring definitely earned the top spot in recommendation, and no, it was not just because I could body Gideon in his stupid face. That was a factor, but it wasn't the whole factor. It was just that I had the most fun in this run compared to the others. And that was Souls, whips only, and that went way better than I expected. Whips are such a bad weapon in FromSoft games, at least generally, but I think the terribleness of the weapon type has been overstated in many ways. They are not good, but they are usable, especially with some weapon buffs or status accumulation. I did want to shout out that I do have a Patreon, linked in the description. I spend a lot of time making these videos, so if you enjoyed the video, want to support the channel, and are financially stable enough to do so, that exists. No pressure though, this channel is free to enjoy for everyone and will remain that way. For now, if you like this video, be sure to hit that like button. If you'd like to see more of this, feel free to subscribe. Hey, maybe leave a comment if you have something you'd like to say. But whatever you decide to do, have a safe trip home.